My name's Cassie May and I'm the curator at Bundoora Homestead for the City of Darebin. The exhibition we have coming up later in 2014 is called Coming Home, and it explores the role of Bundoora Homestead as a convalescent farm and also as a ward for returned servicemen. The homestead was built in 1899 by a wealthy racing family called the Smiths. The Smith family were here operating their horse stud from 1899 right up until 1920, and there were negotiations around 1920 for the Commonwealth to purchase Bundoora Homestead specifically for the task of a convalescent farm for returned servicemen from the First World War. In 1924, as the numbers of returned servicemen grew and the needs grew, Bundoora Convalescence Farm became Bundoora Repatriation Hospital. One of the reasons for the exhibition is to be able to bring to light some of this buried history of the homestead. A lot of the records that we had from the hospital have actually been lost, and it has been a slow research process to be able to bring to light these stories and even the names of the patients that were here. One of the patients that we do know is Wilfred Collinson, and he was a World War I veteran who was admitted to the hospital in 1937.
My name is June Barbara Dalgleish, and Wilfred Collinson was my father.
My grandfather, Wilfred Collinson, was a resident patient for around about, I think it was 36 years. Mum's got a photo of her dad and as a young man. And 2 years ago, I was walking past the photo on Mum's bedside table and I said, I'm going to find out who you are. So I began to get a better understanding of exactly who Wilfred Collinson is. My grandfather was a British migrant. He migrated to Australia in 1914.
He came out to Australia with a very good friend.
Eric Brymer. He actually met on the ship that they were both coming out to Australia on.
And they came here and worked on farms and things like that, and then they joined the army together and they went away together to war.
They enlisted around the same time and they fought together at Gallipoli.
He was gassed 4 times and he was a gunner on those big guns. And that's about all I really know, about his war service.
He returned from the war around about 1919.
He was living next door to my mum in South Melbourne.
Carleen was 18, he was 25.
I think he was a good-looking man. He had beautiful blue eyes. He had a sense of humour, from what I've been told. Yeah, I think he would have been someone you would have noticed.
And they married at Clarendon House in South Melbourne, and that would have been 1920.
I think they started off happily enough and probably free of Dad's problems, but I don't know exactly when his problems actually started.
My grandfather had what we would call a mental breakdown.
He just started to imagine things, became neurotic, I suppose, and imagined there were men hanging around the house. And
he was committed to Mont Park Mental Hospital and later transferred to Bundoora.
Quite often symptoms didn't necessarily arise for the patients immediately after their service. Sometimes it was up to 5, 6, 7 years later that the families at home were finding they weren't able to cope with their beloved family member, with their mood swings, with their attitude. They weren't able to work, they were physically unwell, mentally unwell, and really not understood in general society.
You know, I can remember being at school and they'd say, well, what's wrong with your dad? Oh, it's his nerves. That's about all that, you know, they knew, I think.
If you were a returned serviceman, the families were quite keen to distinguish your mental condition from being a normal lunatic to being a returned serviceman, and quite often the conditions were of a better standard and the family had a larger say in the care of their family member.
The difficulty that my grandmother had in having my grandfather's mental illness and a range of other physical ailments. There were very few that were accepted as being war-related.
His good friend that he came out from England with, he wrote a letter at the time supporting Mum and all that for her to get a pension.
The letter that Eric Brymer wrote in support of my grandfather's mental illness being accepted as war-related, as a war injury. The letter actually describes Wilfred before Gallipoli and Wilfred after.
And he finished his letter off by saying that, and may I say, he said that at the loss of Wilf's sanity. So.
That's why facilities such as Bundoora were so important, because they provided a safe place and a structured environment and an attempt for the soldiers to get better and to recuperate.
I came out here to visit my grandfather, Wilfred.
It was just something that we were going to go and see Dad, you know. We took his afternoon tea, and when we first came, of course, my sister and I were both young, and Mum and Dad would walk in the room and Mum would say, go and meet Dad, and we'd go and meet Dad and he'd give us a kiss. And yeah, he was lovely.
That's what our family did. Our family came out to Bundoora in the same way that my mother came out to Bundoora when she was a child with her mother.
He would talk, but a lot of the times he was speaking so softly, and a lot of times I think he was talking to himself, really. He liked to jot things down on a piece of paper, and he'd say to Mum, have you got a pencil? And she'd give him a pencil and he'd write something down, and he'd have a little chuckle and she'd say, what are you laughing at? But
he hunched over and he constantly had a cigarette, and I believe that that's really how he spent most of his days here.
He would have been here about 36, 37 years, yeah. He died in 1972.
The exhibition aims to bring out those personal side. We're able to view the army records or the medical records, but it doesn't totally put a name and a face or a story together, and that these were real people and real men with families, and they were loved ones ultimately.
I think it's been wonderful for Mum, because she looks at that photo and she says, he looks happier.